Garner lives in Cheshire, close to Alderley Edge, the long-backed hill, high and sombre and black, as he calls it, where he was born and brought up, and where the story of the Weirdstone of Brisingamen is set. It was his first book, and it was published in 1960. The idea sprang from a story that his grandfather told him when he was a boy, the legend of the Wizard of Alderley. The book begins with the arrival of two children, Colin and Susan, at a farm on Alderley Edge. They've been sent to stay there for several months while their parents are abroad. They're to be looked after by Bess Mossock, who was nurse to their mother when she was a girl, and Bess's husband, the farmer Gowther Mossock. It's summer and the weather is fine, so after their first night's sleep at the farm, the children set off to explore the edge, having promised that they'll not go into any of the dangerous old mine shafts that abound on the hill.
It was strange to find an inn there on that road. Its white walls and stone roof had nestled into the woods for centuries, isolated, with no other house in sight. A village inn without a village. Colin and Susan came to it after a mile and a half of dust and wet tar in the heat of the day. It was named The Wizard, and above the door was a fixed painted sign which held the children's attention. The painting showed a man dressed like a monk, with long white hair and beard. Behind him, a figure, in old-fashioned peasant garb, struggled with the reins of a white horse, which was rearing on its hind legs. In the background were trees. "I wonder what all that means," said Susan. "Remember to ask Gowther. He's bound to know." They left the shimmering road for the green wood, and the wizard was soon lost behind them as they walked among the fir and pine, oak and ash and silver birch, along tracks through bracken and across sleek hummocks of grass. There was no end to the peace and beauty. And then, abruptly, they came upon a stretch of rock and sand from which the heat vibrated as if from an oven. To the north, the Cheshire plains spread before them like a green and yellow patchwork quilt, dotted with toy farms and houses. The children stood for some minutes, held by the splendour of the view. Then Susan, noticing something closer to hand, said, "Look here! This must be one of the mines." Almost at their feet, a narrow trench sloped into the rock. "Come on," said Colin. "There's no harm in going down a little way, just as far as the daylight reaches." Gingerly they walked down the trench, and were rather disappointed to find that it ended in a small cave, shaped roughly like a discus, and full of cold, damp air. There were no tunnels or shafts. The only thing of note was a round hole in the roof, about a yard across, which was blocked by an oblong stone. "Huh," said Colin. "There's nothing dangerous about this, anyway." All through the afternoon, Colin and Susan roamed up and down the wooded hillside and along the valleys of the edge, sometimes going where only the tall beech stood, and in such places all was still. Just as they were about to turn for home, after a climb from the foot of the edge, the children came upon a stone trough into which water was dripping from an overhanging cliff, and high in the rock was carved the face of a bearded man, and underneath was engraved, "Drink of this, and take thy fill, for the water falls by the wizard's will." "The wizard again," said Susan. "We really must find out from Gowther what it's all about. Let's go straight home now and ask him. It's probably nearly tea time anyway." They were within 100 yards of the farm when a car overtook them and pulled up sharply. The driver, a woman, got out and stood waiting for the children. She looked about 45 years old, was powerfully built, fat was the word Susan used to describe her, and her head rested firmly on her shoulders without appearing to have much of a neck at all. "Is this the road to Macclesfield?" she said when the children came up to her. "I'm afraid I don't know," said Colin. "We've only just come to stay here." "Oh, then you want a lift? Jump in." "Thanks," said Colin, But we're living at this next farm.
Get into the back.
No, really, it's only a few yards.
Get in.
But we... The woman's eyes glinted, and the colour rose in her cheeks.
You will get into the back.
Honestly, it's not worth the bother. We'd only hold you up. The woman drew breath through her teeth. Her eyes rolled upwards and the lids came down until only an unpleasant white line showed, and then she began to whisper to herself. Colin felt most uncomfortable. They couldn't just walk off and leave this peculiar woman in the middle of the road. Yet her manner was so embarrassing that he wanted to hurry away, to disassociate himself from her strangeness.
Tato,
said the woman. I beg your pardon?
Lapidato,
I'm sorry?
somniato,
Are you...
qui liberata opera facitis.
I'm not much good at Latin. Colin wanted to run now. She must be mad. He couldn't cope. His brow was damp with sweat, and pins and needles were taking all awareness out of his body. Then, close at hand, a dog barked loudly. The woman gave a suppressed cry of rage and spun round. The tension broke, and Colin saw that his fingers were round the handle of the car door, and the door was half open.
Hold the noise, scamp,
said Gowther sharply. He was crossing the road opposite the farm gate, and Scamp stood a little way up the hill, near the car, snarling nastily.
Come on, you.
Scamp slunk unwillingly back towards Gowther, who waved to the children and pointed to the house to show them that tea was ready. That's Mr. Mossop, said Colin. He'll be able to tell you the way to Macclesfield.
No doubt,
snapped the woman. And, without another word, she threw herself into the car and drove away. I don't know, said Susan. It may be the heat, or it may be because we've walked so far, but all the time you were talking to her, I thought I was going to faint. But what's so strange is that my tear has gone all misty. Susan was fond of her tear. It was a small piece of crystal, shaped like a raindrop, and had been given to her by her mother, who had had it mounted in a socket fastened to a silver chain bracelet, which Susan always wore. It was a flawless stone, but when she was very young, Susan had discovered that if she held it in a certain way, so that it caught the light just so, she could see, deep in the heart of the crystal, miles away, or so it seemed, a twisting column of blue fire, always moving, never ending, alive, and very beautiful. Bess Mossop clapped her hands in delight when she saw the tear on Susan's wrist. Oh, if it inna the Bridestone, and after all these years! Susan was mystified, but Bess went on to explain that yon pretty dewdrop had been given to her by her mother, who had had it from her mother, and so on, till its origin and the meaning of the name had become lost among the distant generations. She'd given it to the children's mother because it always used to catch the children's eyes, and their mother was no exception. At this, Susan's face fell. Well then, she said, it must go back to you now, because it's obviously a family heirloom, and... Nay, lass, thou keep it. I've no children of my own, and thy mother was the same as a daughter to me. I can see as how it's in good hands. So Susan's tear had continued to sparkle at her wrist until that moment at the car, when it had suddenly clouded over, the colour of whey. Oh, hurry up, Sue, said Colin over his shoulder. You'll feel better after a meal. Let's go and find Gowther. But Colin, cried Susan, holding up her wrist. She was about to say, do look, but the words died in her throat, for the crystal now winked at her as pure as it had ever been.
And what did old Selina Place want with you?
Said Gowther at tea. Selina Place? Said Colin. Who's she?
You were talking to her just before you came in, and it's not often you see her bothering with folks.
But how do you know her? She seemed to be a stranger round here, because she stopped to ask the way to Macclesfield.
She did what? Well, that's daft. Selina Place has lived in Alderley for as long as I can remember.
She has?
Aye. Hers is one of the big houses on the back hill. A rambling barn of a place it is, stuck on the edge of a cliff. She lives alone there, with what are supposed to be 3 dogs, but they're more like wolves to my way of thinking, though I canna rightly say as I've ever seen them. She never takes them out with her, but I've heard them howling on a winter's night, and it's a noise I shanna forget in a hurry.
All through the meal, Galder entertained Colin and Susan with stories and explanations of things they'd seen in their wanderings, and at last, after frequent badgering, he turned to the subject of the wizard.
I've been saving the wizard till the end. Yon's quite a long story, and now tea's finished, I can talk, and you can listen, and we needn't bother about aught else.
And Galder told Colin and Susan the legend of Alderley.
Well, children, it seems as how there was once a farmer from Mobberley, and at dawn, one still October day, he was riding to Macclesfield Fair. He was in good spirits, and he let his horse, a milk-white mare, set her own pace, for he wanted her to arrive fresh for the market. A rich man would walk back to Mobberley that night. So the farmer drew near to the place known as Thieves' Hole, and there the horse stood still, and would answer neither to spur nor rein. In the middle of the path, where surely there'd been no one, was an old man, tall with long hair and beard. "You go to sell this mare," he said. "I come here to buy. What is your price?" But the farmer wished only to sell at the market, where he would have the choice of many offers, so he rudely bade the stranger to quit the path and let him through, for if he stayed longer, he would be late for the fair. "Then go your way," said the old man. "None will buy, and I shall await you here at sunset." The next moment he was gone, and the farmer could not tell how or where. The day was warm, and the tavern cool, and all who saw the mare agreed she was a splendid animal, the pride of Cheshire, a queen among horses, and everyone said that there was no finer beast in the town. But no one offered to buy. A sour-eyed farmer rode out of Macclesfield at the end of the day. Near Thieves' Hole, the mare stopped. The stranger was there. Thinking any price now better than none, the farmer agreed to sell. "How much will you give?" he said. "Enough. Now come with me." They went by 7 Firs and Goldenstone to Stormy Point and Saddlebowl, and they halted before a great rock embedded in the hillside. And then, children, the old man lifted his staff and lightly touched the rock, and it split with the noise of thunder. At this, the farmer toppled from his plunging horse, and on his knees begged the other to have mercy on him and let him go his way unharmed. The horse should stay, it did not want her, only spare his life, that was enough. The wizard, for such he was, commanded the farmer to rise. "I promise you safe conduct," he said. Beyond the rock stood a pair of iron gates. These the wizard opened, and took the farmer and his horse down a narrow tunnel deep into the hill. The passage ended, and they stepped into a cave, and there a wondrous sight met the farmer's eyes. 140 knights in silver armour, and by the side of all but one, a milk-white mare. "Here they lie in enchanted sleep," said the wizard, "until a day will come, and come it will, when England shall be in direst peril, and England's mothers weep. Then out from the hill these must ride, and in a battle thrice lost, thrice won, upon the plain drive the enemy into the sea." The farmer, dumb with awe, turned with the wizard into a further cavern, and here mounds of gold and silver and precious stones lay strewn along the ground. "Take what you can carry in payment for the horse." And when the farmer had crammed his pockets, his shirt, and his fists with jewels, the wizard hurried him up the long tunnel and thrust him out of the gate. The farmer stumbled, the thunder rolled, he looked, and there was only the rock above him. He was alone on the hill near Stormy Point, and from that day to this, no one has ever seen the gates or the wizard again.
Early in the evening, Colin, who had been very taken with the legend of the wizard, suggested another walk on the edge, this time to find the iron gates.
"Ah, well, I wish you luck. You're not the first to try, and I don't suppose you'll be the last." "Take your coats with you," said Bess. "It gets chilly on the top at this time of day." Colin and Susan roamed all over Stormy Point and beyond, but there were so many rocks and boulders, any of which could have hidden the gates, that they soon tired of shouting abracadabra and open sesame, and instead lay down to rest upon a grassy bank just beneath the crest of a spur of the edge, and watch the sun drop towards the rim of the plain. "I think it's time we were going, Colin," said Susan, when the sun had almost disappeared. "If we don't reach the road before dark, we could easily lose our way." Once over the ridge, they found themselves in a dell, bracken and boulder-filled, and edged with rocks, in which were cracks and fissures, and small caves, and before them a high-vaulted beech wood marched steeply down into the dusk. The air was still and heavy, as though waiting for thunder. The only sound, the concentrated whine of mosquitoes, and the thick, sweet smell of bracken and flies was everywhere. I don't like this place, Colin," said Susan. I feel we're being watched." Colin didn't laugh at her, as he might normally have done. He too had the feeling between the shoulder blades. They'd moved barely a yard up the dell when Colin stopped and laughed. "Look! Somebody is watching us!" Perched on a rock in front of them was a bird. Its head was thrust forward, and it stared unwinkingly at the two children. Colin didn't like the way the bird sat hunched there so tensely, almost eagerly, and they had to pass it if they wanted to regain the path. He took a step forward, waved his arms in the air, and cried, "Shoo!" in a voice that sounded woefully thin and unfrightening. The crow did not move. Colin and Susan moved forward, longing to run, but held by the crow's eye. And as they reached the centre of the dell, the bird gave a loud, sharp croak. Immediately, a cry answered from among the rocks, and out of the shadows on either side of the children rose a score of outlandish figures. They stood about 3 feet high and were man-shaped, with thin, wiry bodies and limbs, and broad, flat feet and hands. The heads were large, having pointed ears, round saucer eyes, and gaping mouths which showed teeth. Some had pug noses, others thin snouts reaching to the chins. The hides were generally of a fish-white colour, though some were black, and all were practically hairless. Some held coils of black rope, while out of one of the caves advanced a group carrying a net woven in the shape of a spider's web. For a second, the children were rooted, but only for a second. Instinct took control of their wits. They raced back along the dell and flung themselves through the gap into the beech wood. Fingers clawed and ropes hissed like snakes, but they were through and plunging down the slope in a flurry of dead leaves. The edge of the swamp was a mass of bodies. The rising moon shone on their leathery hides and was reflected in their eyes. Colin could see white shapes spreading out on either side to encircle the rock. They were in no hurry now, for they knew that escape was impossible. Colin climbed after his sister. He ached in every muscle and was trembling with fatigue. When the circle was complete, the creatures began to advance across the swamp, moving easily over the mire on their splayed feet. Ever closer they came, till the rock was surrounded. From all sides at once the ropes came snaking through the air, as soft as silk, as strong as iron, and clung to the children as though coated with glue, so that in no time at all Colin and Susan fell helpless beneath the sticky coils, and over them swarmed the mob, pinching and poking and binding and trussing, until the children lay with only their heads exposed, like two cocoons upon the rock. But as they were being hoisted onto the bony shoulders, it seemed as though a miracle happened. There was a flash, and the whole rock was lapped about by a lake of blue fire. The children could feel no heat, but their captors fell, hissing and spitting, into the swamp, and the ropes charred and crumbled into ash, while pandemonium broke loose through all the assembly. Then from the darkness above, a voice rang out. "Since when have men children grown so mighty that you must needs meet two with hundreds? Run, maggot breed of Ymir, ere I lose my patience." The crowd had fallen silent at the first sound of that voice, and now it drew back slowly, snarling and blinking in the blue light, wavered, turned, and fled. The cold flames about the rock flickered and died. The moon shone peacefully upon the quiet valley. And as their eyes grew accustomed to this paler light, the children saw, standing on a path beneath a cliff, some way above them, an old man, taller than any they had ever known, and thin. He was clad in a white robe, his hair and beard were white, and in his hand was a white staff. He was looking at Colin and Susan, and as they sat upright, he spoke again, but this time there was no anger in his voice. "Come quickly, children, lest there be worse than svarts abroad, for indeed I smell much evil in the night. Come, you need not fear me." He smiled and stretched out his hand. Colin and Susan climbed down from the rock and squelched their way up to join him. They were shivering in spite of their coats and recent exertions. "Stay close to me. Your troubles are over, though I fear it may only be for this night, but we must take no risks." And he touched the cliff with his staff. There was a hollow rumble, and a crack appeared in the rock, through which a slender ray of light shone. The crack widened to reveal a tunnel leading down into the earth. It was lit by a soft light, much the same as that which had scattered the mob in the swamp. They were in a cave, sparsely but comfortably furnished. There was a long wooden table in the centre, and a few carved chairs, and in one corner lay a pile of animal skins. Through the middle of the cave a stream of water babbled into the channel it had cut in the sandstone floor, and as it disappeared under the cave wall, it formed a pool, into which the old man dipped two bronze cups, and offered them to Colin and Susan. "Rest," he said, pointing to the heap of skins, "and drink of this." The children sank down upon the bed and sipped the ice-cold water. And at the first draught their tiredness vanished, and a warmth spread through their limbs. Their befuddled, shock-numbed brains cleared. Their spirits soared. "Oh!" cried Susan as she gazed at their surroundings as though seeing them for the first time. "This can't be real. We must be dreaming. Colin, how do we wake up?" But Colin was staring at the old man, and seemed not to have heard. He saw an old man, true, but one whose body was as firm and upright as a youth's, whose keen grey eyes were full of the sadness of the wise, whose mouth, though stern, was kind and capable of laughter. "Then the legend is true," said Colin. "It is," said the wizard, "and I would it were not, for it was a luckless day for me. But enough of my troubles. We must discover now what is in you to draw the attentions of this Svart Alpha, since it is indeed strange that men children should cause them such concern." "Oh, please," interrupted Susan. "This is so bewildering. Can't you tell us first what's been happening and what those things were in the marsh? We don't even know who you are, though I suppose you must be the wizard." "Who am I? I have had many names among many peoples through the long ages of the earth, and of those names some may not now be spoken, or would be foreign to your tongue, but you shall call me Cadelin in the days to come, for I believe our paths will run together for a while. The creatures you encountered are of the goblin race, the Svart Alpha in their own tongue. They are a cowardly people, night-loving and sun-loathing, much given to throttlings in dark places, and seldom venturing above the ground unless they have good cause. They have no magic, and so alone are no danger to me, but it would have fared ill with you had I not known their alarm echoing through the hollow hill. And now you must tell me who you are, and what it is that has brought you into such danger this night."
Colin and Susan gave an account of the events leading to their arrival in Alderley, and of their movements since, and when they had finished, the wizard was silent for some time.
This is indeed puzzling,"
he said at last.
"The crow was sent to arrange your taking, and I do not have to guess by whom it was sent. But why the moth brood should be concerned with you defeats me utterly. Yet I must discover this reason, both for your safety and my own, for my destruction is their aim, and somehow I fear you could advance them in their work. Still, perhaps the next move will tell us more, for they will soon hear of what took place this night, and will be much alarmed. But I shall give you what protection I can, and you will find friends as well as enemies in these woods."
But why are you in danger?" said Susan. And who are they? What was it? Moth brood?"
"Ah, that is a long story for this hour, and one of which I am ashamed. But it is also, I suppose, one that you must hear. So, if you are rested, let us go together, and I shall show you part of the answer to your question."
Cadelin led the children out of the cave and down a long, winding tunnel into the very heart of the hill. And as they went, the air grew colder, and the strange light fiercer, turning from blue to white, until at last they came into a long, low cavern. An echoing sigh, like waves slowly rippling on a summer shore, rose and fell upon the air, and before the children's eyes were the sleeping knights in their silver armour, each beside his milk-white mare, just as Gowd had described them in the legend, their gentle breathing filling the cave with its sweet sound. And all around and over the motionless figures the cold white flames played silently. In the middle of the cave, the floor rose in the shape of a natural tomb-like couch of stone, and here lay a knight comelier than all his fellows. His head rested upon a helmet enriched with jewels and circlets of gold, and its crest was a dragon. By his side was placed a naked sword, and on the blade was the image of 2 serpents in gold, and so brightly did the blade gleam that it was as if 2 flames of fire started from the serpents' heads.
"Long years ago,"
said Cadelin,
"beyond the memory or books of men, Nastrond, the great spirit of darkness, rode forth in war upon the plain. But there came against him a mighty king, and Nastrond fell. He cast off his earth shape and fled into the abyss of Ragnarok. And all men rejoiced, thinking that evil had vanished from the world forever. Yet the king knew in his heart that this could never be. So he called together a great assembly of wizards and wise men, and asked what should be done to guard against the enemy's return. And it was prophesied that when the day should come, Nastrond must be victorious, for there would be none pure enough to withstand him, since by that time he would have put a little of himself into the hearts of all men. Even now, it was said, he was pouring black thoughts from his lair in Ragnarok, and these would flow unceasingly about mankind until the strongest were tainted, and he had a foothold in every mind. Yet there was hope, for the world might still be saved if a band of warriors, pure in heart and brave, could defy him in his hour and compel him to sink once more into the abyss. Their strength should not be in numbers, but in purity and valor. And so was devised the following plan. The king chose the worthiest of his knights, and went with them to Fundindelv, the ancient dwarf halls, where they were put into enchanted sleep. This done, the most powerful magicians of the age began to weave a spell. Day and night they worked together, pausing for neither food nor sleep. And at the end, Fundindelv was guarded by the strongest magic the world has known. Magic that would stay the sleeping warriors from growing old or weak, and that no evil could ever break. The heart of the magic was sealed with Firefrost, the Weirdstone of Brisingamen, and it and the warriors became my charge. Here I must stay, forever keeping watch, until the time shall come for me to rouse the sleepers and send them forth against the malice of Nastron. This light around us, Cadelin said, is the magic that guards all here, and its flames are torment to the followers of Nastron. And the source of the magic, as I have said, rests in the stone Firefrost. While Firefrost remains, and there is light in Fundindelv, the sleepers lie here in safety. Yet each day I dread that I shall see the flames tremble and give way to shadows, and hear the murmur of men roused from sleep, and the neigh of horses. For I have lost the Weirdstone of Brisingamen. Cadelin's voice trembled with rage and shame as he spoke, and he crashed the butt of his staff against the rock floor. "Lost it?" cried Susan. "You can't have done. I mean, if it's a special stone, it should be easy to find if it's lying around somewhere in here, shouldn't it?" The wizard smiled grimly. "But it is not here. Of that at least I am certain. Come, I shall show you proof of what I say." He beckoned the children towards an opening in the wall, and into a short tunnel not more than 30 feet in length, and halfway down, Cadelin stopped before a bowl-shaped recess about 6 inches high and a yard above the level of the floor. "There is the throne of Firefrost," he said, "and you will see that it is now vacant." They passed through into a cavern similar to the last, and Colin and Susan halted in awe. Here lay the treasure, piled in banks of jewels and gold and silver, which stretched away into the distance like sand dunes in a desert. "Oh," gasped Susan, "how beautiful! Look at those colours!" "You would not think them so beautiful," said Cadelin, "if you had run through your fingers every diamond, pearl, sapphire, amethyst, opal, carbuncle, garnet, topaz, emerald, and ruby in the whole of this all-too-spacious cave, in search of a stone that is not there. I spent 5 years labouring in this cave, and as many weeks scouring every gallery and path in Fundindelv, but without success. I can only think that that knave of a farmer was a greedier and more cunning rogue than he appeared, and that as he followed me from here, laden as he was with wealth, his eyes fell upon the stone, and he slyly took it without a word. Should Firefrost come into Nastron's hand, my danger would be great indeed. For although he is powerless against the magic it contains, if he could destroy the stone, then the magic too would die away."
Cadelin escorts the children back to the farm along pathways that are safe from the svarts. He tells them how the svarts live underground in the old mine workings, and he asks them not to speak of their day's adventures to Bess and Gowther Mossock. Next day, the farmer and his wife and the 2 children go down to Alderley village. It's very hot, and the children go into the village cafe for an ice cream.
Susan was toying with her bracelet and idly trying to catch the light so that she could see the blue heart of her tear. "It's always difficult to find," she said. "I never know when it's going to come right. Oh, wait a minute. Yes, got it. You know, it reminds me of the light in Fundin." She looked at Colin. He was staring at her, open-mouthed. They both dropped their eyes to Susan's wrist, where her tear gleamed so innocently. "But it couldn't be," whispered Colin. "Could it?" I don't know. But how?" "But how?" "No, of course not," said Colin. "The wizard would have recognised it as soon as he saw it, wouldn't he?" Susan flopped back into her chair, releasing her pent-up breath in a long sigh. But a second later, she was bolt upright, inarticulate with excitement. "He couldn't have seen it! I was wearing my mackintosh! Oh, Colin!" Though just as shaken as his sister, Colin was not content to sit and gape. Obviously, they had to find out, and quickly, whether Susan was wearing Firefrost or just a piece of crystal. If it should be Firefrost and had been recognised by the wrong people, their brush with the svarts would at last make sense. How the stone came to be on Susan's wrist was another matter. "We must find Cadelin at once," he said, "because if this is Firefrost, the sooner he has it, the better it will be for all of us." "Don't you think we'd better go by the path Cadelin told us to use? He said it was the only safe one, remember?" "We haven't time to go all that way round," said Colin. "We must show him your tear as soon as we can." They pressed deeper and deeper into the wood, and came to a level stretch of ground where the bracken thinned and gave place to rich turf, dappled with sunlight. And here, in the midst of so much beauty, they learned too late that wizards' words are seldom idle, and traps well sprung hold hard their prey. Out of the ground on all sides swirled tongues of thick white mist, which merged into a rolling fog about the children's knees. It paused, gathered itself, and leapt upwards, blotting out the sun and the world of life and light. After a quarter of an hour, Colin and Susan were shivering uncontrollably as the dampness ate into their bones. Every so often the trunk of a pine tree would loom out of the mist, so that it seemed as though they were walking through a pillared hall that had no beginning and no end. "We must be moving round in circles, Colin. Let's change direction instead of trying to keep in a straight line." For the next few minutes, the children made their way in silence, Susan concentrating on the ground immediately in front, Colin alert for any sight or sound of danger. All at once, Susan halted. "Hello? What's this?" At their feet lay two rough-hewn boulders, and beyond them, one either side, could be seen the faint outline of others of a like size. "What can they be? They look as though they'd been put there deliberately, don't they?" "Never mind," said Colin. "We mustn't waste time in standing around." And they passed between the stones, only to stop short a couple of paces later, with despair in their hearts, cold as the east wind. Susan's question was answered. They were in the middle of a ring of stones, and the surrounding low, dim shapes rose on the limit of vision as though marking the boundary of the world. Facing the children were two stones far bigger than the rest, and on one of the stones sat a figure, and the sight of it would have daunted a brave man. For 3 fatal seconds the children stared, unable to think or move, and as they faltered, the jaws of the trap closed about them, for, like a myriad snakes, the grass within the circle, alive with the magic of the place, writhed about their feet, shackling them in a net of blade and root, tight as a vice. As if in some dark dream, Colin and Susan strained to tear themselves free, but they were held like wasps in honey. Slowly, the figure rose from its seat and came towards them. Of human shape it was, though like no mortal man, for it stood near 8 feet high and was covered from head to foot in a loose habit, dank and green,
and ill concealing the terrible thinness and spider strength of the body beneath. A deep cowl hid the face, skin mittens were on the wasted hands, and the air was laden with the reek of foul waters. The creature stopped in front of Susan and held out a hand. Not a word was spoken. "No!" gasped Susan. "You shan't have it!" And she put her arm behind her back. "Leave her alone!" yelled Colin. "If you touch her, Cadelin will kill you!" The shrouded head turned slowly towards him, and he gazed into the cavern of the hood. Courage melted from him, and his knees were water. Then, suddenly, the figure stretched out its arms and seized both the children by the shoulder. They had no chance to struggle or to defend themselves. With a speed that choked the cry of anguish in their throats, an icy numbness swept down from the grip of those hands into their bodies, and the children stood paralyzed, unable to move a finger. In a moment, the bracelet was unfastened from Susan's wrist, and the grim shape turned on its heel and strode into the mist. And the mist gathered round it and formed a swirling cloud that moved swiftly away among the trees and was lost to sight.
When they reach the rock, Colin and Susan meet Finoddery, a friendly dwarf, only 4 feet tall, who takes them through into Fundindelve to find Cadelin. The children tell the wizard the whole story, how they realized that Susan's tear was the missing Weirdstone, and how they were bringing it to him when they were trapped and the stone was taken from them by a tall, hooded figure. Cadelin says this was Grimnir, one of the great captains of the forces of evil. He tells them that Selina Place is the chief witch of the Morth brood and known as the Morrigan. And he tells them, too, that for their own safety, they must keep away from him as well from now on. Colin and Susan obey Cadelin's wishes. Weeks and months pass, and it's deep winter when they meet Cadelin again by chance. He tells them that there's still some hope for Fundindelve because Grimnir has not given the Weirdstone to Nastrond. Instead, he schemes to gain mastery over the stone's magic for himself alone. The very next day, the children see that the mist, which always envelops Grimnir in his travels, has gathered around the house of Selina Place, the Morrigan. They go to investigate and discover that Grimnir has taken the Weirdstone there in the hope that the black spells of Selina Place may give him mastery over it.
So intent on her work was the Morrigan, and so wrapped in his thoughts was Grimnir, that neither of them saw the 2 pairs of eyes that inched round the side of the window. The circle was complete. The Morrigan went to the table and picked up the rod.
"It is not the hour proper for summoning the aid we need," she said. "But if what you have heard contains even a grain of the truth, then we see that we must act at once, though we could have wished for a more discreet approach on your part."
She indicated the grey cloud that pressed against the glass, now empty of watching eyes.
"You may well attract unwanted attention."
At that moment, as if in answer to her fears, a distant clamour arose on the far side of the house. It was the eerie baying of hounds.
"Ah, you see, they are restless. There is something on the wind. Perhaps it would be wise to let them seek it out. They will soon let us know if it is aught beyond their powers, as well it may be. For if we do not have Ragnarok and Fundindelv upon our heads before the day is out, it will be of no thanks to you.
She stumped round the corner of the house to the outbuilding from which the noise came. Selina Place was uneasy and out of temper. For all his art, what a fool Grimnir could be, and what risks he took. Who in their senses would come so obviously on such an errand? Like his magic, he was no match for the Weirdstone of Brisingamen. She smiled. Yes, it would take the old sorcery to tame that one, and he knew it, for all his fussing.
All right, we're coming. Don't tear the door down.
Behind her, two shadows moved out of the mist, slid along the wall, and through the open door. "Which way now?" whispered Susan. They were standing in a cramped hall, and there was a choice of 3 doors leading from it. One of these was ajar and seemed to be a cloakroom. "In here. Then we'll see which door she goes through." Nor did they delay, for the masculine tread of Selina Place came to them out of the mist.
"Now, let us do what we can in haste,"
she said as she rejoined Grimnir.
"There may be nothing threatening, but we shall not feel safe until we are master of the stone. Give it to us now."
Grimnir unfastened a pouch at his waist, and from it drew Susan's bracelet. Firefrost hung there, its bright depths hidden beneath a milky veil. The Morrigan took the bracelet and placed it in the middle of the circle on the floor. She pulled the curtains over the windows and doors and went to stand by the brazier, whose faint glow could hardly push back the darkness. She took a handful of powder from the silver plate and, sprinkling it over the coals, cried in a loud voice,
"Demoriel, Carnifiel, Caspiel, Amenadiel."
A flame hissed upwards, filling the room with ruby light. She opened the book and began to read.
"Vos omnes et ministri, ode et destructiones et seratores discorde."
"What's she up to?" said Susan. "I don't know, but it's giving me gooseflesh."
"Eo quod est noce vose coniuriase, idio vos coniro et depreccio."
"Colin, Shh, keep still."
"Et odit fiat mir alve."
Shadows began to gather about the folds of velvet tapestry in the farthest corners of the room. For 30 minutes, Colin and Susan were forced to stand in their awkward hiding place, and it took less than half that time for the last trace of enthusiasm to evaporate. They were where they were as the result of an impulse, an inner urge that had driven them on without thought of danger. But now there was time to think, and inaction is never an aid to courage. They would probably have crept away and tried to find Cadelin had not a dreadful sound of snuffling, which passed frequently beneath the cloakroom window, made them most unwilling to open the outer door. And all the while the Morrigan chant droned on, rising at intervals to harsh cries of command.
"Come Haborim, come Haborim, come Haborim."
Then it was that the children began to feel the dry heat that was soon to become all but intolerable. It bore down upon them until the blood thumped in their ears, and the room spun sickeningly about their heads.
"Come Orobas, come Orobas, come Orobas."
Was it possible? For the space of 3 seconds the children heard the clatter of hoofs upon bare boards, and the wild neighing rang high in the roof.
"Come Nambroth, come Nambroth, come Nambroth."
A wind gripped the house by the eaves and tried to pluck it from its sandstone roots. Something rushed by on booming wings. The lost voices of the air called to each other in the empty rooms, and the mist clung fast and did not stir. Just at the moment when Susan thought she must faint, the stifling heat diminished enough to allow them to breathe in comfort. The wind died, and a heavy silence settled on the house. After minutes of brooding quiet, a door opened, and the voice of Selina Place came to the children from outside the cloakroom. She was very much out of breath.
"And we say the stone will be safe. Nothing can reach it from outside. Come away. This is a dangerous brew. Should it boil over and we near, that would be the end of us. Hurry, the force is growing. It is not safe to watch.
Mistrustfully, and with many a backward glance, Grimnir joined her, and they went together through the doorway on the opposite side of the hall, and their footsteps died away.
"Well, how do we get out of this mess?" said Colin. "It looks as though we're stuck here until she calls these animals off, and if she's going to do any more of the stuff we've been listening to, I don't think I want to wait that long." "Colin, we can't go yet. My tear's in that room, and we'll never have another chance." "But Sue, didn't you hear old Place say it wasn't safe to stay in there? And if she's afraid to stay, it must be dangerous." "I don't care. I've got to try. Are you coming? Because if not, I'm going by myself." "Oh, all right. But we'll wish we'd stayed in here."
He stepped out of the cloakroom and cautiously opened the left-hand door. The dull light prevented them from seeing much at first, but they could make out the table and the reading desk and the black pillar in the centre of the floor.
"All clear,"
whispered Susan. They tiptoed into the room, closed the door, and stood quite still while their eyes grew accustomed to the light. And then they saw. The pillar was alive. It climbed from out the circle that Selina Place had so laboriously made, a column of oily smoke, and in the smoke strange shapes moved. Their forms were indistinct, but the children could see enough to wish themselves elsewhere. Even as they watched, the climax came. Faster and faster the pillar whirled, and thicker the dense fumes grew, and the floor began to tremble, and the children's heads were, of a sudden, full of mournful voices that reached them out of a great and terrible distance. Flecks of shadow, buzzing like flies, danced out of the tapestries and were sucked into the reeking spiral. And then, without warning, the base of the column turned blue. The buzzing rose to a demented whine and stopped. The whole swirling mass shuddered as though a brake had been savagely applied, lost momentum, died, and drooped like the ruin of a mighty tree. Silver lightnings ran upwards through the smoke. The column wavered, broke, and collapsed into the ball of fire that rose to engulf it. A voice whimpered close by the children and passed through the doorway behind them. The blue light waned, and in its place lay Firefrost, surrounded by the scattered remnants of the Morrigan's magic circle. Colin and Susan stood transfixed. Then, slowly, as if afraid that the stone would vanish if she breathed or took her eyes off it, Susan moved forward and picked it up. In silence, she unclasped the bracelet and fastened it about her wrist. She could not believe what she was doing. This moment had haunted her dreams for so many months, and there had been so many bitter awakenings. In a small room, crammed under the eaves, Selina Place and Grimnir waited. Both were key to an almost endurable pitch. They knew well the price of failure. Not once in 1,000 years had any of their kind disobeyed the charge of Nastrond, but all, at some time, had stood in the outer halls of Ragnarok and looked on the abyss. Thus did Nastrond bind evil to his will.
"It cannot be long now,"
said the Morrigan.
"Within 5 minutes the stone must—"
A trail of smoke drifted under the door and floated across the room, and a bubbling sound of tears accompanied it. The Morrigan jumped from her chair. Her eyes were wild, and there was sweat on her brow.
"No, no,"
she mumbled, groping for the door. But Grimnir had already flung it open and was rushing along the corridor to the stairs. He was halfway down the first flight when there was a sound of breaking glass, and the staircase was momentarily in shadow as a dark figure blocked the window at its head. The Morrigan's harsh voice cried out in fear, and Grimnir turned with the speed and menace of a hungry spider. The noise roused Colin and Susan from their trance. Again the Morrigan shrieked. "Here, let's get out of this," said Colin, and he pulled his sister into the hall. As soon as we're outside, run like mad. I'll be right behind you." Quite a hullabaloo was breaking out upstairs, and most of the sounds were by no means pleasant. At least they made the other hazard seem less formidable, until Colin opened the door. There was a rasping growl, and out of the mist came a shape that sent the children stumbling backwards into the house, and before they could close the door, the hound of the Morrigan crossed the threshold and was revealed in all its malignity. It was like a bull terrier, except that it stood 4 feet high at the shoulder, and its ears, unlike the rest of the white body, were covered in coarse red hair. But what set it apart from all others was the fact that, from pointed ears to curling lip, its head and muzzle were blank. There were no eyes. The beast paused, swinging its wedge-shaped head from side to side and snuffing wetly with flared nostrils. And when it caught the children's scent, it moved towards them as surely as if it had eyes. Colin seized a chair. "Get behind me!" he whispered. At the sound of his voice, the brute froze, but only for an instant. It had found its bearings. "Can we reach a window?" Colin dared not take his eyes off the hound as it advanced upon them. "No." "Is there another way out?" "No." He was parrying the lunges and the snappings with the chair, but it was heavy and his arms ached. "There's a broom cupboard or something behind us, and the door's ajar." "What good will that do?" "I don't know, but Grimnir may not notice us, or the dog may attack him, or anything's better than this." "Is it big enough?" "It goes up to the ceiling." "Right, get in." Susan stepped inside and held the door open for Colin as he backed towards it. The hound was biting at the chair legs and trying to paw them down. Wood crunched and splinters flew, and the chair drooped in Colin's hands, but he was there. He hurled the chair at the snarling head and fell backwards into the cupboard. Susan had a vision of a red tongue lolling out of a gaping mouth, and of fangs flashing white, inches from her face, before she slammed the door. Then she fainted. Or at least, she thought she had fainted. Her stomach turned over, her head reeled, and she seemed to be falling into the bottomless dark. But had she fainted? Colin bumped against her in struggling to right himself. She could feel that. And the back of the cupboard was pressing into her. She pinched herself. No, she had not fainted. Colin and Susan stood rigidly side by side, nerving themselves for the moment when the door would be opened. But the room seemed unnaturally still. Not a sound could they hear. "What's up?" whispered Colin. "It's too quiet out there." "Shh. I can't see a keyhole anywhere, can you? There should be one somewhere." He bent forward to feel. "Ouch!" Colin let out a yell of surprise and pain, and this time Susan nearly did faint. "Sue, there's no door." "What?" "No door. It's something that feels like smooth rock going past very quickly. I've skinned my hand on it. That's why my ears have been popping. We're in a lift." Even as he spoke, the floor seemed to press against their feet, and a chill, damp air blew upon their faces, and they were aware of a silence so profound that they could hear their hearts beating.
Colin and Susan are in the dark world of the Svarts. Fortunately, before they encounter any, they're found by Alderley and another dwarf, the fierce warrior Durathor. Suddenly, they hear a great booming sound. It's the summons to all the Svarts to attend a meeting.
"Do not move," Finodri whispered. "Durathor and I go to watch the moot. We shall come back as soon as we know what they intend." The dwarfs went so quietly that even in that silence Colin and Susan heard nothing. Below them, some minutes later, a voice began to speak in harsh, high tones. The language was unintelligible. It was full of guttural and nasal sounds, and the words hovered and slurred most jarringly. The speaker was working himself into a state of excitement or anger, and the crowd was carried with him. Colin felt a hand on his arm. "Come with me," said Finodri. "Shortly you will see, but keep low." Colin groped his way on all fours till he reached Rathraw, who was lying at the edge of the platform and mumbling into his beard. Not long after, Susan joined them. The noise below was now continuous. "They are cowards," said Finodary, "and must be driven to a frenzy to meet our swords, but he does his work well. I guessed it would be so. They are powerless before a sudden light, therefore they are to prepare themselves with fire-drake blood, and here is the keeper." The hysterical voices diminished to a murmur of intense excitement. Then, for a second, the cave was hushed. "Down," whispered Finodary. "He is taking off the cover." A sheet of fire sprang upwards, past the ledge, and boiled against the roof. Roared the svarts. The flame sank to a column 20 feet in height, which lit the cave with a red glare. A similar light had burned in the Morrigan's house earlier that day. "You may look now," said Finodary. Colin and Susan raised their heads, and the memory of what they saw remained with them forever. The floor and walls of the cave were covered with svarts. They swarmed like bees. The first 2 layers of galleries were thick with them, and the children were glad Finodary had climbed so high. On top of the rock stood 2 svarts, one black, the other white, and they were man-size. "There, you see Arthog and Slinkveil, lords of the Svart Alpha. Slinkveil is cunning past the thoughts of men, but Arthog it is who speaks and carries out his brother's word, and his heart is blacker than his hide. See now the fire-drake. The eyes of Svarts can look on it without pain, and it makes them strong to face the purer light of day. Henceforth your lamp will be no weapon." The flame was rising out of a stone cup, full of a seething liquid that was held by a hideous, wizened Svart who sat cross-legged on the sand. He was obviously very old, and his sagging skin was piebald, white and black. "It is time we were gone," said Finodary. "We have a comfortless road ahead." The water was so cold that it took their breath away. Even de Rathraw, the hardened warrior, could not stifle the cry that broke from his lips at the first shock. They waded along the tunnel for a short distance before having to swim, and they had not gone much farther when Finodary stopped and told the others to wait while he went ahead. He drew a deep breath. There was a flurry and a splash, and he did not answer when Colin spoke. "Where's he gone?" asked Susan. "The roof and water meet where he left us," said de Rathraw. 2 minutes passed before Finodary broke the surface again, and it was some time after that before he could speak. "It is no distance," he said when at length his breathing was under control. "And the air is fresh, but the roof is low for many yards, so we must swim on our backs." Another swirl, and he was gone. "I'll wait about a minute," said Susan. She was more frightened than she cared to admit, but she hoped Colin and de Rathraw would think her teeth were chattering with the cold alone. "Right, here goes." "She has great courage," said de Rathraw. "She hides her fear better than any of us." "Are you scared too?" said Colin. "Mortally. I will pit my wits and sword against all odds and take joy in it, but that is not courage. Courage is fear mastered, and in battle I am not afraid. Here, though, the enemy has no guile to be countered, no substance to be cast down. Victory or defeat mean nothing to it. Whether we win or lose affects us alone. It challenges us by its presence, and the real conflict is fought within ourselves. And so I am afraid, and I know not courage." "Oh," said Colin. He felt less isolated now, less shut in with his fears. "Well, I'd better be on my way." "Good luck to you," said de Rathraw. Colin held his dive as long as possible, but the icy water constricted his lungs, and he was soon in need of air. He rose to what he implored would be the surface, but his hands and the back of his head scraped against the roof. Flustered, he kicked himself into a shallow dive, his stomach tightening, and his head seeming about to burst. This time, no. Again he struck the roof. What was wrong? Why was there no air? Finodary had said Ah, he remembered. Swim on your back. The roof is low, that's it. Colin turned frantically onto his back. The knapsack pulled down at his shoulders and began to tilt him upside down. He threshed the water and managed to right himself, and then his lips broke surface. The air rushed out of his lungs, and Colin promptly sank, swallowing a lot of water. He kicked off so violently from the tunnel floor that he nearly stunned himself on the roof, but it quelled the panic, and he lay on his back, breathing air and water by turns. The roof was certainly low. In order to keep his lips above water, he had to squash his nose against the rough stone of the ceiling, which made progress as painful as it was difficult. After 20 yards, Colin was relieved to find that the distance between the surface and the roof was increasing, and before long he was able to turn onto his face and swim more naturally. But where were the others? He trod water.
Hello! Ahoy! Sue!
Here! It was Susan's voice, and not far ahead either. Almost at once the water grew shallow, and then he was knee-deep in mud, and Finoddery's arm was about him.
The children go through many more dangers and difficulties, guided by Finoddery and defended by Durathro, whose cloak of eagle's feathers gives him the power of flight. Finally, they reach daylight and the sanctuary of the farm. Their next task is to take the Weirdstone to Cadelin. This time, Gowther Mossock comes with them. They have a terrible journey, for by now the massed forces of evil are ranged against them. The svarts of the Morth brood, witches and warlocks, and in the sky flocks of ragged, sharp-eyed birds. When they gain the top of Alderley Edge, they see Cadelin approaching a long way off. By this time, they're closely surrounded by the creatures of Selina Place, the Morrigan, and Grimnir.
A circle!
Shouted Gowther.
Colin, Susan, into the middle!
And so they took their stand, and all evil closed upon them.
They are not to die yet.
Cried the Morrigan.
Who takes a life shall answer with his own.
Back to back, the dwarfs and Gowther fought, silently and desperately. And in between crouched the children. The bestial shout, the grunts and squeals of dying svarts echoed from valley to valley. Finoddery and Durathro wove a net of light with their swords as they slashed and parried and thrust. And when Gowther swung his stick, skulls split and bones cracked. Their one hope was to survive until the wizard came. But where an enemy fell, there was always another to take his place, and another, and another, and another, and another. They fought themselves to a standstill. Gowther's stick was knocked from his hands, but he bent and took up a svart hammer in either hand, and from that moment the slaughter increased. Following his example, the weaponless children snatched themselves weapons and entered into the fight. And thus for a while the battle ran their way, but it was the last flare of a guttering candle before the night swamps all. The end came suddenly. A svart hammer crashed home above Finoddery's elbow, and the bone snapped with the noise of a whiplash. His sword arm, hanging, useless, Finoddery was a broken wall, and soon the enemy would pour through the breach. Durathro acted. He pushed out his free hand behind him while keeping his eyes fixed on his work. "The stone! Give me the stone!" Without questioning, Susan ducked behind Gowther, took off the chain bracelet, and locked it about Durathro's wrist. As she did so, a dozen pairs of hands clutched her and dragged her backwards, but too late. Durathro sprang into the air. Valam, his cloak, enfolded him, and he turned towards Shutlingslow in a last attempt to save the stone. And the birds fell upon him like black hail. He disappeared from sight as though into a thundercloud. The lightning of his sword flashed through the smoke of birds, and the earth grew dark with their bodies. The battle on the ground was done. All eyes were upon that in the air.
Nothing of Durathor could be seen as the cloud moved slowly away, but few birds were dropping now. Lower down the hillside, a round knoll stood out from the slope, topped by a thin beech wood, and on its crown a tall pillar of gritstone jutted to the sky like a pointing finger. Clulo was its name. Over this mound the last blow was struck. A white object fluttered out of the base of the mass, hovered for a moment, pitched forward and crashed through the trees, and lay still. Down rushed the svarts, howling. At the noise the figure stirred. Durathor raised his head. Then he hauled himself upright against a grey trunk, steadied himself, and began to walk up the hill. He lurched and stumbled from tree to tree. His mail shirt was ripped half from his back, and Valum, his cloak, hung in ribbons. Often he would stand, swaying on his feet, and it seemed that he must fall backwards, but always he would stagger on, bent almost double, more wounded than dwarf, leaning his full weight upon his sword. So Durathor came to the pillar of stone. He put his back against it and unclasped his belt. Loosening it, he threw it round the column and buckled it tightly under his arms so that he should not fall. When this was done, he grasped his sword in both hands and waited. For 10 yards around, the hilltop was bare of trees, and at the edge of the circle the svarts halted, none wanting to be the first to cross the open ground and meet that sword. But it was only for a moment.
"There is the stone!"
cried the Morrigan from behind.
"Take it!"
"Gondimar!" thundered Durathor. Where he found the strength is a mystery and a great wonder. But such was his fury that none could withstand him, not even Arthog, lord of the Svart Alpha, that was as big as a man. In the thick of the press he came against Durathor, and Durathor brought his sword round in an arc. The Svart parried with his hammer, but the sword clove through the stone, and Arthog's head leapt from his shoulders. But no sword can shear through stone unpunished, and at the next stroke the blade snapped halfway to the hilt. Yet still Durathor fought, and none who faced him drew breath again, and the time came when the Svarts fell back to the trees to regain their strength, and to prepare a last assault. Durathor sagged in his harness, and the stump of his sword hung by his side. His head dropped forward onto his chest, and a silence lay upon the hill. Above the clearing in the wood circled a carrion crow. It spiraled down, barely moving its wings, and came to rest on top of the standing stone. A long time it perched there, watching, motionless. The silence was overpowering. And then the crow launched itself into the air and resumed its measured glide. Closer to the drooping warrior it came, closer, closer, and settled on his shoulder. But Durathor did not move. His trial was over. A sigh rose through the trees, and the crow hopped from the dwarf's shoulder to the ground. Straight to his wrist it went, and from there back to the pillar, with Firefrost dangling at its beak. The bird threw up its head, neck feathers blown into a ruff, and, with wings outstretched, began to dance a clumsy jig. It rode grotesquely from side to side, its head bobbing up and down, and a yell of triumph burst forth from every side. Grimnir cast a quick glance over his shoulder. Yes, he must act at once. If the crow should drop its eyes and look above the throng, it could not fail to notice. Swiftly he strode down the hill and pushed through the moth brood. And as he went, a new cry moved with him, for in turning to see who was coming so impetuously from behind, the crowd looked behind him and panicked. Colin, Susan, Garther, and Finodiri had watched Durathor's battle in an agony of helplessness. Fury and despair had done their worst. Their minds were numb with shock, so it was with little interest or emotion that they turned their heads when the note of fear ran through the moth brood. Then Grimnir came upon them. He faltered, but only for a second.
"Kill them,"
he said to the guards. Susan opened her mouth, but no sound would come. For the first time in memory or legend, Grimnir had spoken, and the voice was the voice of Cadelin. The moth brood was scattering in all directions. The guards were more intent on saving their own lives than on taking life away from others. For this is what they saw.
Racing out of the north was a cloud, lower than any that hid the sun, and black. Monstrous it was, and in shape a ravening wolf. Its loins fell below the horizon, and its lean body arched across the sky to pouncing shoulders, and a head with jaws agape that even now was over the far end of the valley. Eyes glowed yellow with lightning, and the first snarls of thunder were heard above the cries of the moth brood. There seemed to be one thought in all their minds: escape. But when Managam of Ragnarok is about his master's bidding, such thoughts are less than dreams. The svarts were beginning to break when Grimnir entered the wood. He kicked and trampled through them towards the pillar. The crow was still there, squatting low, its head deep in its shoulders, glaring at the oncoming cloud. It saw Grimnir on the edge of the clearing, read his purpose in a flash, and sprang. But Grimnir was too agile. He jumped, snatched high, and his fingers closed about the bird's scaly shins, and swept it out of the air. The other thin-gloved hand wrenched Firefrost from its beak. Grimnir cast the heap of feathers viciously against the pillar and fled. "After him!" shouted Finodori. "He must not escape!" The hillside was thick with pell-mell bodies, but Grimnir could not be easily lost, and they set off blindly without thinking what they could do if they caught him. Grimnir leapt onto the wall and stood poised, as though staring at something in the lane. Then he turned and ran back down the hill, moving faster than ever. But Grimnir had barely left the wall when he staggered, and a sharp cry broke from him, and he toppled onto his hands. A double-edged sword stood out from his back. Along the blade coiled two serpents of gold, and so bright were they that it pained the eyes to look on them. Slowly Grimnir rose until he was on his feet. The sword dropped to the ground. He took 3 steps, swayed, and then fell backwards. The deep cowl slid from his face, and the madness was complete. It was the face of Cadelin, twisted with pain, but nevertheless Cadelin. Kind, noble, wise, his silver beard tucked inside the rank, green, marsh-smelling, monk-like habit of Grimnir, the hooded one. Susan thought she was out of her mind. Colin could not think or speak. Finodori wept. Then there was a crunching of rock above them, and they looked up. Someone was climbing over the wall. It was Cadelin. He came towards them over the snow. His eyes, too, were full of tears. No words were spoken in greeting, for it was a moment beyond words. Cadelin dropped onto one knee beside Grimnir, and the tears spilled onto his cheeks. "Oh, Gavanon," he whispered. "Gavanon." Grimnir opened his eyes. "Oh, my brother, this is the peak of the sorrow of all my years, that it should come to this, and at my hand." Grimnir raised himself on one elbow, and, ignoring Cadelin, twisted his head towards the wood. An eager light gleamed in his eyes. Among all the haphazard scuttling, one figure moved with a set purpose, and that was Selina Place, who was running towards the little group as fast as she could, her robes streaming behind her. Grimnir brought his head round and stared at his brother, but he did not speak. Their eyes spoke through the barrier of years, and across the gulf of their lives. Again Grimnir turned to Selina Place. She was close. He looked up into the smoking jaws of Managam, and then at Cadelin. A bleak smile touched the corner of his mouth, and he lifted his fist and dropped the stone into Cadelin's hand, and fell back, dead. Cadelin took up the sword and sheathed it. He turned to the Morrigan. She stood a dozen yards away, glowering, uncertain. She was not sure what had happened. Then Cadelin held up Firefrost for her to see. "Get you to Ragnarok!" Selina Place, fury in every line of her, shrieked and ran, and as she ran a change came over her. She seemed to bend low over the ground, and she grew smaller. Her robes billowed out at her side, her thin legs were thinner, her squat body heavier. And then there was no Selina Place, only a carrion crow rising into a sky of jet. "Make haste," said Cadelin, "or we ourselves shall be lost. Gauther Mossack, will you stand here in front of me? I shall put my hand on your shoulder. Colin, Susan, stand on either side.
take hold of my robe. Do not let go. Finoderi, sit by our feet. Cling fast to my hem.
All the sky to the north and east was Wolfhead. The mouth yawned wider, till there was nothing to be seen but the black, cavernous moor rushing down to Swallow Hill and Valley Hole. Witches, warlocks, svarts stampeded southwards, crushing underfoot any that blocked the way. The birds outdistanced them all, but they were not swift enough. One bird alone did not go south. It flew towards the advancing shadow, climbing ever higher, until it was a black dot against a blacker vault, and even a dwarf's eyes could not tell if it did clear the ragged fangs that sought to tear it from the sky. As the hill slid down the boundless throat, Cadelin lifted his right hand and held Firefrost on high. Gowther stood firm. Colin and Susan clasped their arms about Cadelin's waist, and Finoderi grappled to him with his one good arm as much of the wizard's robes as he could hold.
Drox, Morok, Asenaroth.
A cone of light poured down from the stone, enclosing them in a blue haze. A starving wind, howling like wolves, was about them, yet the air they breathed was still. Slanting yellow eyes were seen dimly through the veil, hungry eyes. And there were other noises and other shapes that were better left unknown. The fury raged and beat against the subtle armour, but it was as nothing to the power of Cadelin Silverbrow with Firefrost in his hand. And at last, at once, the darkness passed, and the blue light faded. Blinking in the sunlight of a brilliant sky, the survivors of the wrath of Narstrand looked out over the fields of white, wind smooth and as empty of life as a Pona shore. No svarts stained the snow. No gaunt figure lay close by. The pillar of Clulo was bare. Away to the south a black cloud rolled. There was joy and many tears. And this tale is called the Weirdstone of Brisingamen. And here is an end of it.